This case is often compared to the movie Poltergeist because it involves the sometimes negative cost of economic expansion, a family moving into their dream home, being terrified by some unexplained force, and finally fleeing when their family is attacked and they just can't take it anymore. Their problems stem from the fact that their house was built on top of a cemetery to make room for new homes. And in Poltergeist, the cemetery was supposedly moved, but we find out that only the headstones were removed. The dead and their coffins never left. And this is the story of a neighborhood that was built over Black Hope Cemetery. In the early 1980s, Houston was growing rapidly, and in order to accommodate all of the new people, multiple subdivisions were built. Now, one of these new subdivisions was called the Newport Subdivision in Crosby, Texas. One of the first families to move in was Sam and Judith Haney, and they were the first to experience the strange phenomena that we'll be discussing. As it usually goes in these situations, they couldn't have been happier in the beginning. It was really a dream come true for them. There was another family that moved in this subdivision. Their last name was Williams, and they were just as excited as the Haneys, and they were planning to have a swimming pool built in their backyard. However, the pool contractor became suspicious when he noticed that the underground sewer lines had been rerouted. They would soon learn their new home's creepy secret, and this is when things started to get weird. Shortly after the Haneys moved in, a man that was identified as L.D. Wrestler, he was a longtime resident of the area. He told the Haneys that their backyard was once part of a cemetery, and he pointed to where the bodies were buried. They wanted to do the right thing, so they decided to find out whose remains were actually buried in their backyard. This search eventually led them to Jasper Norton. He was also a longtime resident. He told them that he buried the bodies there himself when he was a teenager, and that unbeknownst to any of the people moving into the subdivision, the land had once been a cemetery for mostly former slaves, and it's called Black Hope Cemetery. He told him that there were at least 60 graves still in the area. And after the Haneys learned this, they thought about an old oak tree in their yard that had an arrow and 2 horizontal lines on it, and they thought that it had to be a grave marker. The man told him that he was the one that marked the tree because his 2 sisters were buried somewhere beneath it. So using a backhoe, Sam decided to see if Jasper's claims were true. Well, they were, because soon Sam's shovel hit something made of wood, and at that point, they stopped using the backhoe and Sam started to dig by hand. He started seeing pine boards, and when he lifted up the first board, he saw an indentation of a skeletal form, and Sam immediately called the sheriff and the county coroner who conducted an official exhumation. Most of the bones had turned to powder, and while 25 fragments were found, some were so brittle that they would just disintegrate when they were touched. 2 wedding rings were also found on the remains of one of the bodies, and Judith was handed the rings, and she said she was sickened to think that they had just desecrated someone's grave. The remains were that of Betty and Charlie Thomas, and they were born into slavery and were freed during the Civil War, and they died during the 30s, and unfortunately their graves were forgotten. The last burial in the cemetery was in 1939. So the land that the Haneys were living on used to be a part of the McKinney plantation. And when slavery was abolished, the family gave a portion of their land to their 5 former slaves. Eventually, the land was sold to Purcell Corporation, a construction company. And during the construction of the Haneys' house, Purcell's field superintendent was informed that at least 1 human grave was on the land. He examined the gravesite and noticed a short fence around it as well as a cross. Employees at Purcell Corporation knew about the gravesite, yet they still bulldozed the fence posts around the graves anyway. The cemetery had never been officially recognized by Harris County. The Haneys sued the developer for not disclosing that their home was built over a cemetery, and they also wanted people to know the cemetery existed. They were awarded $142,000 for what they went through, but a judge reversed that ruling and said the developers weren't liable, so they were then ordered to pay $50,000 in court costs. At the trial, there was testimony on the family's supernatural experiences, and the movie Poltergeist was also mentioned because of the graveyard connection. Ben and Jean also wanted to take legal action, but developers needed proof that the cemetery actually existed. In order to prove that, Jean started digging up her backyard to find the remains. As soon as she started digging, she began to feel sick, so her daughter Tina volunteered to take over. After about 30 minutes or so, Tina started having chest pains. She said she felt funny and was getting dizzy, so she put the shovel down and went inside to lie down. She said, "Mom, Daddy, I don't feel right. There's something wrong." The last thing Jean said she remembered was Tina saying, "Mommy, take care of my baby." She looked so scared, and Jean said she tried to keep Tina conscious while they were waiting for paramedics to arrive, but her eyes started to glaze over almost immediately. She kept trying to talk to her, trying to talk her daughter out of dying, but her eyes kept changing and soon she wasn't responding at all. The paramedics did arrive quickly, but they got lost on the way back to the hospital, and by the time they arrived at the hospital, Tina was already brain dead. She had suffered a massive heart attack. She was on life support for 2 days before the family made the decision to let her go, and she was only 30 years old. And Jean believed that her death was caused by supernatural forces. She said she realized that she had desecrated a grave, and now she was paying for it. The Haneys weren't successful at finding any living relatives of Betty and Charlie Thomas, so they decided to rebury them on their property. When Sam and Judith reburied them in their backyard, they prayed that their spirits would rest in peace, but that's not what happened. There was a clock in their bedroom, and one night it started sparking and putting out a blue glow, and when Judith checked the clock, it was unplugged, but that was just the beginning. The toilets would flush on their own, and as the water went down, they could hear people talking. There was something in that house that wanted to be heard, and they wanted their presence to be known. They'd hear the back door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps walking towards them. But as usual, when they checked, there was no one there. One night, after taking a shower, Judith heard their sliding glass door open and then close. Then she heard someone ask, "What are you doing?" She assumed it was her husband Sam coming home from work, but when she called out to him, no one answered. When she checked the door, it was locked. On a different day, Judith went to look for her red shoes and she couldn't find them, so her husband helped her look. Guess where they found them? They discovered that day was Betty's birthday, and Judith said that she got the feeling that Charlie was giving Betty a birthday present. On some of the hottest days in Texas, they would feel spots of ice-cold air in the house. They felt like someone was always watching them, and it terrified Judith to be in the house alone, and she never felt peace. She constantly had a sense of foreboding, a feeling that things just weren't right or that something bad was about to happen. They weren't the only ones who experienced this. A dozen of their neighbors also reported lights, televisions, and water faucets just turning on and off by themselves. Many heard unearthly sounds, and they saw apparitions. Another neighbor, Vinay Luna, reported coming home one night, and both her husband and her dog were just staring straight ahead at the television, and they wouldn't acknowledge her presence. It was like they were frozen. 2 weeks later, her husband finally told her why they reacted that way. He said that when he came home, he saw their dog floating in a back corner. When he walked over to their dog, he also bent down to pick up his slippers. His slippers had flown out of his hands and across the room. So he and their dog didn't look at her because they were both still terrified. Jean and Ben's electric garage door opened hundreds of times on its own. They'd smell fresh brewed coffee every morning at 5 o'clock. And there were incidences when the birds nesting around their house would peck their babies to death. Random shadows would be seen on their walls, followed by whispering and a putrid smell. One time, when Ben came home from working the late night shift, he opened the refrigerator and he noticed 2 ghostly figures out of the corner of his eye. The figures then went into the den and down the hall towards their bedroom. In their bedroom, he saw one of them standing about 1.5 feet from the end of their bed. When he ran towards it and through it to protect his wife, he felt a sticky, cold sensation inside. And Jean didn't like being in the house alone either. Her plants kept dying regardless of what she'd do, and sinkholes started to appear in the shape of a coffin near their flower beds. They would fill them in, but they just came right back a few days later. She came to the realization that this had to have something to do with Betty and Charlie's graves being disturbed. She believed that these things wouldn't stop happening unless they moved, but they didn't have enough money to put down on another house. And since they had always been fighters, they decided to stay a little while longer. But at this point, Jean could no longer fight. And after 7 years of living in Texas, they moved to Montana where they had a support system. However, their problems didn't stop. Within months, 6 of their close relatives were diagnosed with cancer, and 3 of them died. All 3 of their daughters had gotten divorced, and 1 suffered from serious mental problems. Ben and Jean, who had always been healthy, were sick with unexplained ailments. They felt their illnesses were caused by the spirits of the house. The experiences intensified over the years, and eventually most gave up their homes and fled, losing their investments. While the Williams were trying to sell their home, they wanted to dig up the depressions on their property to prove that the sunken spots were actually graves, but that was against Texas law. They could only put a clause in their homeowner's contract saying that their home was probably located over a graveyard. The family eventually moved back to Texas, and they wrote a book called The Black Hope Horror, The True Story of a Haunting, and it was published in '91. And the movie Grave Secrets is based on that book. It was released in '92. This case also aired on Unsolved Mysteries on July 17, 2002 for the first time. A family that lived in the Haney's old house for about 3 years had this to say. During that time, we never experienced any paranormal activity, but we were continually harassed by the media and the public. CBS aired the movie Grave Secrets, and they had someone from the CBS National Morning Show come out to interview us. I explained to the reporter that we didn't want to be interviewed, but the interview was still shown on the CBS Morning Show. People would also continually knock on the front and back doors, wanting to see the graves and the markings on the tree. In the 3 years we lived there, my daughter and her friends who lived in the Williams' old house, they were never afraid. We had a privacy fence around the yard, but people would still climb over that to look. But instead of being afraid, she says that they chose to take care of the graves. They also believed that there was some grandstanding and that the families were out to make money. Some did make money, but others lost it because of the publicity and the decrease in property values. She said that stress is a tool of the devil's, and that it can play horrible tricks on one's mind, and it allows us to believe certain things. Mary Anderson also lives in the neighborhood, and she's worked to identify the remains of the people buried in the graveyard, and the organization Respect Houston was willing to move the graves to give them a proper burial, but they all have to be identified first. So any information that may help identify those buried in Black Hope Cemetery can be emailed to hopeforbblackhopegraveyard@gmail.com.